Imagine a girl from the most dangerous planet in the galaxy, sitting quietly in a classroom full of alien geniuses. No one expects her to speak. No one believes she belongs. But when a legendary professor gets Earth's history completely wrong, she stands up and in just 60 seconds rewrites everything they thought they knew. This isn't just a story about war. It's about truth, legacy, and the courage to raise your hand when the universe is watching. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Lena Vey didn't look like much. Small, quiet, and pale compared to the luminous, colorful beings around her. She sat near the back of the lecture hall, trying not to attract attention. Her hair was tied back simply, and her plain clothes didn't shimmer or glow like those of her classmates. Among the dozens of species present, some floating, some slithering, others covered in feathers, fins, or fur, she was the only human. That fact alone made her the center of whispered curiosity. Earth was new to the Solari Union, and humans were still considered a mystery that made many uneasy. The Solari Union Academy of Strategic Arts was located on an artificial planet called Severin Core. It wasn't a real planet, but a giant ring world, a massive floating classroom built to hold beings from thousands of worlds. The academy's size was almost laughable. Classrooms the size of stadiums, floating dormitories that moved with gravity shifts, and translators that whispered in dozens of languages at once. It was said that only the brightest minds got accepted into the academy, those destined to become military advisors, peacekeepers, and tacticians for entire planetary systems. The best from over 10,000 species gathered there. And somehow, Lena Vey, a quiet teenager from Earth, had made the list. She didn't know how many of the other students thought she belonged. Most just stared from a distance. Humans were still seen as wild, dangerous. Earth had been classified as a hazard-level planet, the kind of world where storms could burn the sky and creatures evolved to eat anything that moved. So when the Union first met humans, they didn't think peaceful neighbor. They thought problem waiting to happen. But Earth had surprised them. Against all odds, humanity had survived, thrived, and made it to the stars. Now the Union wanted to study them, and Lena had been chosen as part of that exchange. Today's class was one of the largest, advanced historical strategy. The instructor, Professor Tharakjin, floated into the hall on a cushioned airlift. He was from a water-based world shaped like a large eel with a face full of eyes and glimmering blue skin. He wore the heavy sashes of the academic order, each color representing a different degree. It was said he held 12, all in military theory. As usual, his tone was full of pride as he addressed the room. Today, he began, his voice echoed. Through the translation devices, we examine a conflict from Earth's violent past, a time where chaos ruled and primitive nations fought over frozen mountains and rivers. Lena straightened slightly in her seat. Professor Tharakjin waved a ribbon-like limb toward the center of the room, where a glowing battlefield appeared, in mid-air. The hologram showed rugged mountains, sharp valleys, and clusters of small dots, troop formations in red and blue. It was a simulation of a war, and not just any war. Lena recognized it. Her breath caught, but she said nothing. For now. This engagement, the professor continued, occurred in Earth's second planetary war, during their 20th cycle century, a time of limited intelligence and basic warfare. Here, as you can see, the defending forces position themselves along the northern ridge. The attackers in red approach from the west. The result, a failed offensive due to poor planning. He sounded so sure, but Lena's heart was starting to race. That wasn't how it happened. The terrain was close, yes, but the troop positions were flipped. The approach vectors were completely wrong, and the battle hadn't ended in failure. It had been a major victory for the attackers, who used the mountains, weather, and deception to surprise the defenders. She had read about it, studied it. More importantly, her great-grandmother had been there. Lena had the old letters and copies of her unit's reports. The real details were etched in her memory, and now this floating scholar was presenting it, all backward. She could feel it, the heat building in her chest. Not anger exactly, but frustration. She had promised herself to stay quiet, to blend in. Earth was under observation, and humans weren't exactly trusted yet. Speaking out in class, especially against a decorated professor, could make things worse. But the wrongness of it scratched at her thoughts like a pebble in a boot. The hologram shifted again, and Theric Jin continued. This flawed strategy shows us the limitations of Earth's early warfare methods. Brute strength over precision. Repetition instead of innovation. It's no wonder such tactics were abandoned in favor of more sophisticated models. Lena almost laughed, not out loud, but in her head. This battle had been a turning point in mountain warfare. It was still studied back on Earth, not for its mistakes, but for its brilliance. She looked around. The other students watched the simulation with interest. A few made notes. No one questioned it. And why would they? Who would expect the lone human in the back to know more than the Academy's most celebrated war historian? Her hand twitched. The choice was there. Stay silent and let it pass, or speak up. Her heart pounded as the moment dragged. The professor's explanation was wrong. So wrong it felt almost insulting. But it wasn't just about pride. It was about truth. If they couldn't get a simple battle right, what else were they wrong about? She looked down, took a breath, then raised her hand. The room froze. All eyes turned toward Lena Vey. At first, no one moved. A few students blinked their eye clusters, others twitched their antennae or shifted their color-sensitive skin in shades of confusion. It was rare for anyone to interrupt a senior professor, especially a Deathworlder student from a species that most still barely understood. The air in the vast room felt suddenly heavy. Even the ambient hum of the translation unit seemed quieter, like the room itself was holding its breath. Professor Theric Jin slowly rotated in the air toward her. His blue skin darkened slightly in what his species used to express mild irritation. His many eyes focused on Lena with visible curiosity and just a hint of disbelief. "Yes, Student Vey?" he asked. His voice, though polite, carried an unmistakable tone of warning. "Do you have a question?" Lena stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't shift nervously or apologize. Her voice was calm, clear, and steady. "Not a question, Professor," she replied. "A correction." The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. A few students shifted uncomfortably. One feathered classmate a few seats away from Lena leaned slightly away from her, as if expecting something to explode. Correcting a Solari professor was practically unheard of, especially during a live simulation. But Lena's face showed no fear, just quiet certainty. Professor Theric Jin tilted his head, the thin gill-like fronds along his neck fluttering. "A correction," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Please do elaborate." Lena stepped forward toward the center of the room, toward the glowing simulation hovering over the floor. Her footsteps echoed in the high chamber. The professor made no move to stop her, but his long fingers twitched as she reached the control pad beside the display. "I've studied this battle since I was young," she said. "It's still taught back home in every school. The version shown here isn't just inaccurate, it's reversed." Her fingers moved quickly and confidently across the controls. The projection shimmered. The red and blue units swapped directions. The terrain adjusted slightly, showing passes and ridges that hadn't been highlighted before. The room stayed quiet, every student watching intently now. "The defenders weren't in the valley," she continued, adjusting the blue markers. "They were positioned along this slope here. They assumed it was impassable due to the rain and early frost. But the attacking force used local guides and light gear. They split into 3 groups and came through these forested passes." She tapped the hologram, and lines traced new movement paths, stealthy, winding, smart. "It wasn't a failed attack," she said. "It was one of the most unexpected breakthroughs of the entire campaign. The defenders weren't prepared. Within 72 hours, their lines were broken and they had to retreat to secondary positions." A long silence followed. Professor Theric Jin's limbs hung motionless. his many eyes flicking between the display and the human girl standing before it. Slowly, the corrected version of the battle played out. Red units slipping through narrow paths, circling, surrounding, breaking the lines. It was a completely different outcome. "You are certain of these details?" he asked after a moment. Lena nodded. "Yes, Professor. Very certain." "And may I ask your source?" His voice was even, but his gaze was sharp. "Primary sources," she answered. "Historical records, military files, personal journals. My great-grandmother fought in this battle. She was part of the flanking group that moved through the eastern pass at night. Her unit's movement was what caught the defenders off guard." At that, a quiet murmur rolled through the class. Many species lived for centuries. For them, wars that happened just a few hundred years ago were ancient history. But humans? Their lifespans were short. Their connection to the past was much more personal. For Lena to have a relative who had actually been there on the ground made the story feel more real and more disturbing. Professor Therek hovered in place, his eyes narrowing slightly. His long fingers tapped against the edge of his hover disk. "I see," he said finally. "That is enlightening." Lena didn't smile. She didn't look smug. She simply stepped back, letting the corrected display continue playing, red and blue units moving in new, accurate patterns. The room remained silent. It was clear to everyone watching that she hadn't spoken up to embarrass the professor. She hadn't done it for attention or to show off. She had done it because it was wrong, and because she knew how it really happened. One of the classmates, a tall insectoid with bright green eyes, raised a hand slowly. "Is it common," he asked, his translator blinking, "for humans to learn about such detailed tactics in school?" "Yes," Lena said. "It's part of basic history education. We study strategy alongside geography, politics, and economics." Several students exchanged surprised glances. A few took new notes. Others simply stared. Lena returned to her seat. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The simulation now showed the true battle with quiet precision, and her presence had shifted the room in a way no lecture ever could. From the corner of his eye cluster, Professor Therek watched her closely. His pride was wounded, but his mind was already working. He had always thought of humans as unpredictable, perhaps even crude. But this quiet girl had calmly overturned an entire lesson with facts, clarity, and personal truth. And that, he realized, was more dangerous than any weapon. After the class ended, a quiet buzz of curiosity followed Lena wherever she went. The wide corridors of the Solari Union Academy, normally filled with the soft hum of translators and the flicker of holographic signs, seemed more alert, more watchful. Students who had ignored her before now glanced her way, some openly, some with shy sideways stares. She walked calmly, her steps measured, her gaze forward. But even she could feel the change. Something important had happened back in that lecture hall, and everyone knew it. Lena hadn't meant to start a storm. All she'd done was correct a mistake. But in doing so, she had shown something deeper, something the Academy had not expected, from a human. She had not only understood the tactical details of a forgotten battle, but she had explained it with the confidence of someone who knew the past, not as dusty facts, but as something living. That unnerved people more than the correction itself. The next day, in the shared study chambers, a few students gathered near her table. They didn't sit too close. Old instincts still held some back, but their curiosity pulled them forward. One of them, a soft-voiced creature named Cyril with skin like polished stone, leaned forward and asked gently, "Is it true what you said? That your great-grandmother was there? In the actual war?" Lena looked up and nodded. "Yes. She was in the mountain unit that crossed the eastern ridge." A thin, winged student named Hepa tilted their head. "You speak as if it's normal to know that kind of history. On my world, wars are remembered through official memorials, not family stories." "For us," Lena replied, "it's both. We have the records, books, archives, even digital libraries. But we also have the memories, passed down, Letters, photos, personal stories. There was a pause. The students around her listened closely. Many of them came from long-lived species with deep histories, but those histories were distant. Their great-grandparents had lived in time so far back they felt like myth. But humans? Their history was close, tangible. And Lena's story made that real in a way no textbook ever could. Cyril asked, "Is that common on Earth? For your people to learn these things so early?" "It's part of our education," Lena answered. "We study battles not just to memorize names and dates, but to understand the choices people made, the terrain, the weather, the people behind, the decisions." Another student, tall and covered in iridescent scales, looked puzzled. "But why? If the war is over, what's the use in knowing it so well?" Lena smiled slightly, not unkindly. "Because we've had to learn the hard way. Earth isn't an easy place to live. Mistakes cost lives. If we don't learn from them, we repeat them." The room fell quiet again, the students processing her words. Some looked down at their tablets. Others simply stared at her, their expressions, a mixture of awe and something else. Respect. Professor Therakjin observed from a distance, hovering near a library wall with his many eyes narrowed in thought. He hadn't spoken to Lena since the class, but he hadn't stopped thinking about what she had done either. She had calmly undone an entire lecture in front of him, and done it without arrogance or hesitation. He had taught strategy for decades, advised military leaders on multiple planets, and written 3 books on battlefield psychology. But a teenager from a death world had shown him a blind spot he didn't know he had. Later that day, he called Lena to his private study. She entered with her usual calm demeanor, but she was curious. He gestured for her to sit, then floated in front of her, unusually quiet. "You caught me by surprise," he admitted. "Not because you were correct, that happens, but because of how you knew." "I studied," she said simply. "Yes, but you studied differently," he replied. "Most students memorize. You remembered, you understood." Lena didn't respond right away. Then she said, "On Earth, understanding is how we survive. Our world doesn't forgive lazy thinking. History isn't something we put behind glass, it's something we walk with every day." The professor considered her words. He thought about how the Solari viewed Deathworlders, strong, stubborn, unpredictable. But now, he was starting to see something else. Adaptability. Insight. A different kind of intelligence shaped by chaos, not comfort. "Would you be willing," he asked, "to co-lead a session on tactical adaptation? I believe your perspective would be enlightening." Lena looked at him, slightly surprised, but she nodded. "Of course." He floated back slightly, watching her. "I never thought I'd say this," he said, almost to himself, "but perhaps humans have more to teach us than we realized." As Lena left his office, she passed other students in the halls. They no longer avoided her gaze. Some even nodded in greeting. She didn't need applause or praise. What mattered was that the truth had been heard, and that something, however small, had changed. The academy had brought her there to study humanity, but now it seemed that humanity had something to teach them too. The next week brought a quiet transformation at the Solari Union Academy. Word of Lena Vey's correction had spread far beyond Professor Therakjin's lecture hall. It was now being talked about in study chambers, faculty lounges, and even among visiting scholars. Not because it had been loud or dramatic, but because it had been calm, precise, and impossible to ignore. The young human who had once gone unnoticed was now the subject of curious respect and quiet admiration. No one said it aloud, but many students had started to watch their own lectures more closely, wondering what else might be missing from the stories they had been told. Lena remained unchanged. She still sat in the same seat, still took careful notes, and still avoided unnecessary attention. But those around her now saw her differently. When she raised her hand, the class listened. When she spoke, they took notes. And when she was quiet, some waited just in case she might add something. She had not demanded respect. It had been earned through knowledge, composure, and truth. Her story had become a quiet reminder that wisdom can come from unexpected places. The day of the joint session arrived. and the main chamber was full. Students from multiple programs came to listen. Professor Tharakjan began the lecture with his usual confidence, but now with a trace more humility in his tone. Today, he said, we welcome an alternate perspective, one born not of theory but of memory. Lena stepped forward when invited, her expression calm as always. The holographic display lit up once again, but this time she wasn't just correcting it, she was leading it. She began not with battle maps or troop movements, but with something simpler. My great-grandmother, she said, wasn't famous. She wasn't a commander or strategist. She was a soldier. She carried supplies through freezing rain, crossed mountain trails in the dark, and did what she had to do so others could survive. Her words weren't written for books. They were for her children. But those words taught me more about strategy than any textbook. The room was silent. No flashing lights, no dramatic gestures, just a simple story told with honesty. Then she brought up the same battle, but from a human perspective. She explained not just the movements, but the mindset, the fear, the choices made in the middle of chaos. And then she showed how that battle taught lessons that shaped training for decades after. This is how we learn on Earth, she said, by understanding not just what happened, but why it mattered. The simulation played out not as a lecture, but as a shared experience. She asked questions, invited others to consider alternatives, and gently corrected mistaken ideas without shame or pride. When it ended, the students didn't clap. They simply sat quietly, thinking. That silence was more powerful than any applause. After the session, several students came to Lena with questions, not just about Earth, but about how humans approached learning. One asked, "Do all humans carry these stories like you do?" Lena smiled and said, "Not everyone tells them the same way, but yes, many do. It's part of who we are." Professor Tharakjan remained nearby, listening. For a long time, he had seen humanity as rough, unpolished, even primitive. But Lena's approach had changed his view. She had not just challenged his information, she had changed how he thought about learning itself. Not as a hierarchy, but as a conversation. Later that evening, the professor updated the Academy's central knowledge archive. He amended the simulation, adding Lena's corrections as part of the official version. He noted the source: personal, accounts, direct family memory, and human academic training. It was the first time a student had directly contributed to the historical database. It would not be the last. Lena, meanwhile, sat alone in the Academy gardens that night, looking up at a sky filled with stars unfamiliar to her. She had not planned any of this. She had come to learn, not to teach. But something inside her felt right. Not proud, not victorious, just steady, like she had done what needed to be done. Back on Earth, her great-grandmother's letters were still kept in a worn folder in her family's home. Handwritten pages that had survived war, time, and now, space. Those words had once been meant for one small girl in a quiet room. Now they had helped rewrite part of galactic education. The next day, classes resumed as normal. But things weren't quite the same. Students from other species began asking more questions, sharing their own cultural histories and comparing strategies in new ways. Lena's actions had opened a door, not just between human and alien thinking, but between generations, between theory and memory, between past and future. She didn't consider herself special, just a student like everyone else. But as she walked the halls, she passed by a new display panel. It showed a timeline of the Carpathian battle, now corrected. At the bottom was a small credit, submitted by student Elve Earth. She stopped for a moment, looked at it, and then continued walking, a small smile on her face. What had started as a quiet correction had become something bigger, a reminder that knowledge is not always where we expect it to be, and that sometimes history doesn't belong only to those who write it, but also to those who remember it. In the end, Lena Vey hadn't changed the galaxy. She had simply told the truth. But sometimes that's enough to start everything else.